So we'll now move on to panel 1 on Pacific climate immobilities and resilience. And we've got 4 really interesting presentations on different dimensions of climate mobility in the Pacific. And we're going to begin with Dr. Liam Moore and Dr. Henrietta McNeill on the development of a typology of climate immobilities. So I will just, as I come up, introduce them. Dr. Liam Moore is a lecturer in international politics and policy at James Cook University. His research interests span from politics in Oceania through emerging debates around climate mobilities and across discourses of normative change, contestation, complexity, and international orders. And Dr. Henrietta McNeill is a research fellow in the Department of Pacific Affairs here at the ANU. Her research focus is Pacific regional security and the security migration nexus, particularly transnational crime, criminal deportations, border security, citizenship, and security cooperation. Thank you both.
Thank you very much to the Development Policy Centre for having us here today and just about organising it. Liam and I have come up with this topic that's a typology of climate immobilities, and it speaks quite well to what Stephen's just gone through with a range of different types of mobilities. So we're going to share the presentation, so I'll hand over to Liam.
Yeah, so this came about because, well, it's ended up being part 1 of a 2-part project, because we were trying to do something about the policy impacts and realised we needed this climate mobility typology first. We needed some sort of structure and definitions. And so at a broad level, we know climate change is already affecting decisions to move. And we're seeing, particularly across the Pacific, with Vanuatu, Fiji, now Solomon Islands, looking at relocations and climate mobility policies. So we're seeing some action on this as states try to grapple with what do policy solutions look like. But particularly across academia, the terminology and the categorizations we're using are lacking nuance, they're lacking specificity, and it's a problem. We really can't grapple with the real impacts of the policies until we actually know what we're talking about. And so I went back through the archives and looked at these previous conceptions. So starting off with this idea of environmental refugees and going through climate refugees and how it's evolved, and it's, you know, a deeply problematic term that is inaccurate for the context, but also is not a legal definition. It's too narrow, and you know, some are arguing it's quite a race concept as well. So instead, there's been this response and this push towards climate mobilities, climate immobilities, which realistically is much better. It encompasses much more of the types of mobility that we're seeing, the range of distances, timeframes, motivations. But it is, by its nature, quite a broad and all-encompassing terminology. When you want actual policy impacts that drive action on the ground, that can obscure what the actual solutions are and how they work. And so we decided a typology was probably the answer here. And we were discussing this morning, we're usually quite critical scholars. We don't do solutions often. We're really good at problems. But in this case, we went, oh no, we've got to do the part 1. We've got to find some sort of framework. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We want something that's going to spark a bit of discussion and contestation even, but something that can be useful for scholars, practitioners, policymakers. And so we've come up with what we think are these 10 types of immobilities. So we have 5 types of internal and 5 cross-border. And the goal here is to reduce a bit of that uncertainty and a bit of that terminology slip, so we can be clear about what exactly we're talking about, what solutions we're looking for. And I think Henrietta is going to go now and speak about some of these types and some of the examples as well.
Yeah, so as Liam said, we've got 5 types of internal and 5 types of cross-border mobilities. And most of them are fairly well acknowledged separately, but they've never been put into a typology before. And we think this will really help with policymakers. So I'll go through an example of each so that you can understand why we're talking about these specific types of mobilities rather than just talking about climate migration generally, because it makes it easier for policymakers. So in terms of evacuation and to avoid immediate harm, we see this as the rapid physical movement of people away from harm. So we're talking about floods, cyclones, fires, things that mean that people have to temporarily move away from their area to become safe. And in the paper, we use the example of Australia and those fires, the Black Summer fires. We talk about how evacuation is in many ways saving lives and getting people away from harm, but it's also talking about evacuation prior to a devastating effect. So asking people to leave early to make sure they're not in harm's way. There's also remain in place or in situ adaptation. And this, I know we've talked a lot about in the Kiribati context around migration with dignity, those who choose to stay in place or are rooted in place in Tuvalu. And then there's also those who are trapped, so unable to move because of economic or reasons. We're thinking about Malakuta during the Black Summer fires. Those people were unable to be evacuated for a long period of time because of the fires that were in place. So when we're talking about remaining in place, we're talking about voluntary and involuntary. And so there's different policy choices that need to be made in response to either voluntary or involuntary adaptation. To move locally, planned relocation.
Apparently this is my stuff. So we're quite specific with our planned relocation in that we argue that it is very spatially bounded. It's also bounded by moving a community as a large contingent. Like it has to be kept together, but it has to be spatially bounded. Because once you move beyond a certain distance, it does become a different type of mobility, where you need a different type of plan, a different type of solution. So we look at the examples from Fiji paper and look at the relocations and how it's been done on, on lands that are already owned and how that maintaining ties and getting around the difficult problems of finding new land can actually be a very specific type of solution.
To move within a country sounds a lot like moving locally or planned relocation. But we see it as slightly different because if you're moving locally, there might be some things that you can maintain and keep. But if you're moving further than, I think we're talking about 20 kilometres, then it actually things change quite a lot and policy settings have to be different. You have to make sure that there's policies in place to support people in a different kind of way. So we look at the situation of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 in the Philippines, where Tacloban city was moved about 20 kilometres. And this wasn't a planned relocation. It was because it was too distant from a locally movement. And as I say, that has different requirements. And again, urban mobility, so moving to the city. And this is mostly unmonitored. There's very little research done in this space about, because people just get up and move, right? And there's not a lot of research and policy making done in this space. And so, but those people still have needs because they've relocated. So we wanted to include this as part of the typology to ensure that there was potential for targeted policy making. We also did cross-border migration in our typology, and this again included 5 aspects. I guess I want to point out that the majority of climate-related mobility is internal, but as Stephen pointed out, we're looking at different ways of doing migration and mobility as we're looking into the future, and so cross-border mobility is becoming increasingly discussed. We've got temporary humanitarian protection to avoid, again, those acute hazards. And again, this is just temporary. So we're talking about, in the paper that we've written, about 85,000 Haitians who have gone to Brazil following the earthquake, and they've sought humanitarian protection visas. That has led into a migration law, which accounted for environmental protection, although that's still slightly debated and the definition isn't quite there. And there are some issues with the exploitation, but in general, there are some temporary humanitarian protection settings out there for environmental change. We also talk about existing temporary mobility pathways, and as Stephen mentioned, it's things like the labour mobility schemes like PALM, like RSC, And Aka Remon does some really great work here talking about how those pathways can build skills and support things like migration with dignity. However, their labour mobility does create some precarious conditions, and it is still temporary. So it may not be the perfect solution for all people trying to migrate due to climate displacement. And that's why we're talking about a typology, is they have to be really different settings. We also talk about existing permanent mobility pathways. So as Stephen mentioned, that's about open migration. It's about the compact and free association states in the Northern Pacific. It's about Cook Islands and Niue who have New Zealand citizenship. And it's about the Samoa and Pacific quotas, the Pacific engagement fences. All of these settings are put in place that are existing permanent mobility pathways that we know are being increasingly used for climate change displacement. We've also got the preemptive climate pathways, and Whalepili is a really good example of this. Did you want to speak to that?
I'll just say quickly that because of the difficulty in the causality here of trying to actually establish, are you moving for climate reasons? And one of the things that Whalepili does well is it disconnects that. There's no need to actually prove any sort of causality. It is just the migration scheme. It doesn't say climate in that whole section of mobility. So that's where we think, particularly in these cross-border ones, you can disconnect the two. There doesn't have to be that intrinsic link, which could end up being quite important. And then also we have this idea tacked on at the end, formal refugee protection. Obviously, it hasn't been used. It's attempted a few, but long discussions, and we debated whether it was in or not. And Matt Scott actually convinced me that yes, it should still underpin this. It should be at the end as almost a safety net for if there is targeted persecution based around climate related or lack of action around climate related circumstances. So we've included it, but we know not being used, and even if it was used and came to set precedent, it would be just a tiny bit of this mobility.
So that's a really quick summary of quite a lot of different mobility pathways. But we thought that putting this typology in place will allow policies to be discussed that might specifically address different aspects of climate mobility. And we hoped that that might mean that they were able to succeed. What we really started with was a conversation about why do some policies fail and why do some succeed. But we, as Liam said, we had to figure out what those policies were and how they fit into a package to be able to understand how they all kind of fit together. But where we're going next with this is actually to look at which policies succeed and which ones fail and why. And we've kind of come up with a bit of a four-prong rationale for perhaps why, and we're happy to take feedback on this. But the first is we think that it will succeed if there's a political will and commitment of resources towards policy. And we also think it will succeed if there's longevity over governments. And so we see that climate change obviously does not is not bound by 3-year terms of governments. And so the mobility policies need to go across those government terms as well. The third prong is that we think they'll succeed if they focus on only one aspect of that typology. That doesn't mean that they can't have multiple different policies that each address different aspects of the typology, but that if they're trying to cross many aspects of the typology, they're more likely to fail because they're not actually going to meet the needs of the people who are moving. And the fourth one, and for me the most important, is that the protections have to be in place to avoid exploitation regardless of the mode of migration or choosing to remain. But there has to be things to support people to not be exploited. Did you want to add anything to that? No, I think that's us. Thank you.
Thank you both very much, and thank you for keeping to time. We're just going to move straight on to the next person. We'll do all 4 presentations and then have about half an hour, hopefully, for Q&A at the end. So please just make a note of any questions that you might have, and we'll cover them at the end. So I'd now like to introduce Lauren Plant. Lauren is a PhD candidate at the University of Canterbury, Aotearoa New Zealand, and her PhD research focuses on resilience building in the context of the Aotearoa Pacific Partnership, which is about at the end of September. And Lauren's presentation is going to critically examine Aotearoa New Zealand's approach to supporting Pacific climate-related migration and its implications for fostering climate resilience in the region.
Okay, good morning, kia ora, atamari, everybody. I'm Lauren and I came here from the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And today I'm just going to be presenting on an aspect of my PhD research that I'm about to finish. So I'll get straight into it. Oops. Okay. So my PhD research focuses on the Aotearoa Pacific Partnership for Climate Crisis Resilience Building, where I find several resilience paradoxes where Aotearoa is simultaneously investing in resilience building whilst also contributing to vulnerability within that same space. So the title of my thesis is just up there on the board. I've termed the findings the resilience paradox, which includes 7 paradoxes that inhibit Aotearoa's resilience approach from actually building climate crisis resilience in the Pacific. And these 7 paradoxes are just listed up there on the slide. The second one, the conceptual paradox, I actually presented on at ANU earlier this year in February and wrote an in-brief on. So if you're interested in other aspects of this research, you can check that out. But today I'm focusing specifically on the mobility paradox. It's obviously a very complex issue, but in the context of this workshop, I think it was those strings together between labour mobility, development and climate resilience in the Pacific. So just a little bit of scene setting. In 2021, Aotearoa introduced the resilience approach, which frames resilience as the key to empowering Pacific Island countries to navigate the escalating challenges that are arising from the climate crisis, economic pressures and geopolitical instability in the region. The resilience approach outlines steps for Aotearoa to strengthen its partnerships with Pacific Island countries and to build the capacity of Pacific communities to withstand and adapt to mounting pressures. Due to issues associated with climate vulnerability and economic pressures, mobility has become quite a central aspect to climate resilience building. It's also being framed as a climate adaptation method. So the resilience approach also explicitly links the concept of resilience to the issue of labour mobility, which is shown through a 2023 cabinet paper, an excerpt of which is just up here on the slide. And it states that labour mobility is a key driver of economic and social resilience in the Pacific region. The Reset to Resilience cabinet paper positions labour mobility as an integral part of promoting prosperity and resilience. And the RSE scheme is New Zealand's primary labour mobility vehicle to achieve these gains. So it's this connection between resilience and mobility that sort of sets the stage for my critical examination of the RSE scheme, as it serves as the key vehicle for the mobility aspect of the resilience approach. So just a little overview of what the RSE scheme looks like. It was introduced in 2007. And its purpose is to allow for employers from Aotearoa to recruit workers from 9 Pacific countries to fill labour shortages in the horticulture and viticulture industries. Workers typically come for a 7 to 9 month period per year, and the current cap has just been increased to 20,750 workers. It's largely labelled as a triple win, benefiting employers in Aotearoa, Pacific Island countries, and also the RSE workers themselves. And it has been hailed as best practice in terms of temporary labour migration schemes. It's also been praised for its development impacts through the Strengthening Pacific Partnerships program, which includes things like training workshops, secondments, technical assistance, supply of equipment, and various health-related initiatives, just to name a few. However, on the flip side, there is also a few challenges to this triple win narrative. Firstly, it's been argued that the underlying economic logic of the scheme exerts a sort of economic influence that undermines its potential as a development initiative in the way that the scheme prioritizes Aotearoa's industry needs over Pacific development goals. It's also been argued that the economic benefits may be somewhat overstated. McKenzie and Gibson 2014 paper, so mind you, this was 10 years ago, found that when accounting for costs in Aotearoa, airfares, household size, amongst many other variables, that the average per capita increase in take-home income for workers is much lower than the total income at around only 35%. And more recently, there has also been some significant human rights concerns, which has led to a lot of bad press. In 2022, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission review found that there are major gaps in the scheme that allow for human rights abuses, including poor housing conditions and restricted personal freedoms. So there's clearly some quite concerning issues regarding the development and human rights aspects of the RSE scheme, but what I really want to focus on today is the way that it impacts climate crisis resilience in the Pacific. So my PhD research finds that the RSE scheme contributes to the resilience paradox. While it provides access to resources through remittances, it also can simultaneously undermine in situ community resilience in Pacific Island countries in a few ways. The first of these is brain drain and skills loss. So it was highlighted in my research that there is a departure of semi-skilled and skilled workers from Pacific Island countries into Aotearoa. A large issue with this is the way that the scheme is being implemented, what contradicts its original intent of providing opportunities for unemployed youth. And this message was pressed by the current president of Samoa when she first came to power, and also in a recent TV interview on TV New Zealand by the president of Vanuatu. Secondly, the scheme is contributing to a demographic imbalance in PICS. This is due to the way that it targets young, fit labourers, which depletes Pacific Island countries of key demographics that are critical for in situ community resilience. Thirdly, it was highlighted in my research the way that schemes like RSE contribute to rural depopulation, as it typically siphons talent from rural areas, primarily of working age males, that might undermine sustenance-based economies, which threaten traditional community structures that are critical aspects of community-based resilience in a Pacific setting. Next is the way that it contributes to critical industry shortages. Participants in my research noted the ways that the scheme creates labour shortages, which increases vulnerability in essential sectors. And road maintenance was an example that came up a few times. And finally, all of these aforementioned issues are further exacerbated by the way that the scheme tends to have a disproportionate impact on smaller countries with smaller populations, which can lead to more significant social and economic impacts compared to larger countries with larger populations. So at the centre of this paradox lies the asymmetry in the relationship between PICS and Aotearoa in the RSE scheme, but also more broadly. While it does provide economic benefits to PICS through remittances, its primary objectives is to serve Aotearoa's economic interests. A Dyer and Neef paper in 2023 noted that from a New Zealand government perspective, the current operation of the RSE scheme is weighted heavily in favour of employers' needs, with development objectives very much a secondary concern. And so this asymmetry manifests in several ways, and yes, I know there's also a typo on that slide, sorry. So firstly, the scheme's primary function is to serve Aotearoa's economic interests. It prioritises short-term gains over long-term development, and the skills gained in country are not necessarily transferable or relevant to the workers' home situations. It potentially traps workers in a perpetual cycle of seasonal work, which doesn't necessarily allow for career advancement or permanent migration. And the aforementioned brain drain effect that I spoke about on the previous slide might come at a cost to developing PIC's local industries and economies. And there is another layer to this mobility paradox for resilience building, which is the way that the RSE scheme has been framed as a form of Aotearoa support for climate-related mobility. So currently, the scheme is the only implemented mobility scheme in Aotearoa that has been connected to its support for climate-related mobility. Other immigration policies that specifically address this are currently lacking. The Diane Neef paper in 2023 also observed that Aotearoa has been increasingly linking the concept of migration as adaptation to the RSE scheme. However, I think this framing is problematic for a few reasons. Firstly, it's retroactive, as the original purpose of the scheme was to address labour shortages in Aotearoa and not to address climate-related migration. So I think that this retroactive framing potentially obscures the scheme's primary economic motivators. Secondly, there's also a misalignment between PIC's preferences around climate-related mobility, as they have expressed a desire largely to prioritise in situ adaptation and maintain their communities at home. So the framing of the RSE scheme as a climate-related mobility solution doesn't necessarily align with this priority. There are also restrictive eligibility requirements, including age, fitness, and language proficiencies, which often exclude the most vulnerable who may be the most at risk of climate crisis impacts. So this selectivity somewhat contradicts the notion of the scheme as comprehensive support for climate-related mobility. And finally, there is a lack of specific climate-related provisions in the RSE scheme. It remains fundamentally a mobility program, which lacks the necessary components to address the complex and unique needs of climate-displaced individuals and communities. So while I have taken quite a critical lens of the RSE scheme today, I do just want to stress in my conclusion that I don't think that it's all bad and there's nothing to be savoured and we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think in the context of climate resilience, which is my focus, there are definitely some things that we need to pay attention to. I think what is clear is that not only does the RSE scheme contribute to a sort of resilience building paradox, but it doesn't on its own constitute for actual support for climate related mobility, despite being referred to as such. So to address this, I've got a few implications or recommendations, if you will. The first one is that we need to decouple the RSE scheme from climate mobility narratives. It needs to be recognised for what it is, which is a temporary labour migration scheme, rather than being framed as a solution for climate displacement. This would allow for more open and honest discussion about the scheme's purpose and impacts, the development of separate and more targeted solutions for climate mobility. And it also avoids conflating economic migration with forced climate displacement, which have distinct challenges and require separate policy approaches. Secondly, we need to develop permanent climate mobility focused immigration pathways for those who need to or wish to move, that target the most vulnerable and also accommodate the various typologies of climate mobility or immobilities. We also need to address the asymmetrical benefits of the RSE scheme, which includes a restructuring to better balance Aotearoa's economic needs with PIC's development needs. And finally, we need to ensure adequate and context-specific investment in long-term capacity building and or supplementation in PICs, which focuses on enhancing resilience within Pacific Island countries themselves to mitigate the negative impacts of outward migration on climate resilience. So to end here, the resilience paradox, of which the mobility paradox contributes to, is ultimately a symptom of wider policy incoherence in Aotearoa, where it struggles to balance its domestic settings with its international rhetoric. I think when the intended goal is to build climate resilience, it is necessary to address these interconnections between the many issues and understand the ways that they mutually affect and reinforce one another. Resilience needs to be addressed in a multidimensional and holistic way. And without this, resilience interventions may risk being maladaptive or even counterproductive. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lauren. It was really interesting. I've got 1 or 2 questions for you later. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christina Newport. Tina is based in Rarotonga. She's a descendant of Ngāti Tamakio and Ngāti Tatika in Rarotonga, with links to Manaia and Aitutaki in the Cook Islands. Tina has a PhD in development studies from the University of Auckland, and since 2010 she has operated Aotearoa Consulting, which provides climate change and development related research and policy services. She has recently completed 2 Pacific multi-country studies, one on the links between climate change and mental health and well-being, and a second on community perspectives of climate mobility. And Tina's going to talk about debate.
Kapuri au ki te atua kira mo te rangi teitei, a ka meitaki i a tātou I te era, I te uipangi uipa anga nei, te aka meitaki au ki te matakenanga o te ipukaria, o te inua nei, kapuri au ki a tātou tupuna, o tātou tangata, ki a tātou kainga. Just wanted to acknowledge the spirit within us all that brings us here today, to the people of this land, to their ancestors, to our ancestors, and to all of our people that we bring with us into this space. We want to acknowledge us all here today. Thank you. And I'm also here on behalf of our University of Auckland team. I want to talk to you about a project that we have been working on. It's a sign. I hope you take that into account on that time. So we've been involved in this particular project. You will see there's a cue card if you want to see all of our publications that result from this project. You can find it in that thing there, and we'll put it up again on the last slide. So the project is looking at climate and mobility research in the Pacific. This is one part of 3 projects within a New Zealand MFAT funded research program looking at climate mobility. Overall, its aim was to improve understanding of climate and mobility in the Pacific. We focused on 7 countries in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Niue, and the Cook Islands. We also focused on some transnational communities for the ones in Tokelau and also the Cook Islands, and one community from Tuvalu. So we worked with 17 communities from those 7 countries. It was a very ambitious research program that required obtaining ethics for 7 applications for ethics, which I'm sure many of you will appreciate what that involves. So 7 individual applications per country, plus each country has its own research approval processes to work through. So undertaking those as well, to all be completed to start the field work, and it got underway in May last year, which then was completed. Last ones were done late October. So an intense period of field work, and even more intense period of analysis and writing to be able to deliver completed products to the client by the 30th of June. So one of the things that with this great presentation at the beginning around the typology of climate mobility, thank you so much for doing that. So that means I don't have to talk about it here. But certainly there are some big issues around how we define and understand the different types of climate mobility that communities are undertaking, and we very much focus on communities. It's a perspective that is often overlooked. There's lots of, in terms of the research, there's focus on individuals and families, but not necessarily at this community level. So that was where we were focused. We looked at areas of decision making, how communities make decisions, not just in terms of climate related mobility, but all kinds of ways that they make decisions. We looked at their understanding and experiences of resilience and vulnerability. We looked at land tenure and marine tenure. There was initially, it was seen that we were just only focused on land tenure, but we made the case that actually can't talk about Pacific communities, but also without also talking about their tenure over their tenure and use over their waters. We looked at conflict, we looked at health and well-being, and we looked at climate mobility associated loss and damage. So quite a big scope. One of the other big things that we looked at was the regional population dynamics. There is a particular policy brief, policy paper in the suite that we have that gives you lots more detail, but I just want to highlight some of the, say a couple of things about the issues that we had to deal with. This was work that was undertaken by Bedford and Bedford as part of our team, of which Charlotte and Richard were instrumental in completing and undertaking that work along with Wolf Friesen. And it's good to have those kind of numbers, demographic experts in your team, because it's certainly not my field of expertise. So we really appreciated what they were able to do in terms of being able to set that demographic scene about where is the growth in population, where are the declines, what's the structure, and when and how are people moving. And they looked at this from over a 100-year period from 1950 with projections out to 2050. So over a 100 years kind of span, what can we expect to see with the movement of our people in the region, given the current kind of mechanisms that are in place, but also about the impacts of climate change and the effect that that will have on those decisions of communities to move and or stay. So some of the issues, and this is really a plug for as a policy implication that, you know, there were issues with the data, that not all of it is complete. And if we think about Papua New Guinea, which doesn't have necessarily the most recent demographic data through census, we're not necessarily dealing with the most accurate information to be able to have certain kind of certainties. But having said that, the other thing about PNG, of course, is that the population is a significant contributor to where and how we go in the future. They make up, projections are that they will make up, let me get these numbers right. So PNG currently has over 70% of the region's population. And that projections out to 2050, we can expect a population in total for the region of 19.8 million, and 15 million of that will be PNG. So, you know, that's a huge factor to take into account as part of the context of climate mobility. Right, let me get into some of these findings. No, I'm not going to talk to you quickly about our research approach. So this is a Pacific-led, Pacific-centered research proposal. In fact, gave us the opportunity to actually do something really dynamic, really innovative and different from what we've seen being called for by governments. And so this was a really exciting opportunity for us to be involved, to put together a team that really focused on our values and our principles as Pacific researchers. And so some of the things that were very important in our design was our sense of belonging to those communities and to those places. And so that was a very much an important part of our design. We acknowledge our histories and our experiences as Pacific social scientists who are familiar with and well embedded in our kind of ways of working around Pacific research methodologies. We understand and live our commitments around our obligations and to serve our communities. So, you know, we're heavily invested in this, and there is nothing apolitical about that. So it's very much an important part of how we designed the research, and of course, our communities, the people of those communities are seen as collaborators, and so that means that whatever we produce, they must be the first beneficiaries of that. And part of our co-design approach and co-creation, co-production was to return to each of those communities and take those products back. And that was not an easy thing to do by the 30th of June. So some of the places that we were in, and as I go through these slides, I'm actually going to talk to you with some examples of those communities, some descriptions of them, and try and kind of make the links to what's on the slides. I'm not sure how well we're going to do with this, but certainly it's something that's our approach. Just quickly too to say that I have with the two of our research team, Grace Shaw and Roy Burnett. Part of our approach was to bring in young Pacific researchers, scholars, people interested in this field of work. And so 99% of our researchers are from the region, Pacific people. And so it was important that we, you know, as some of us as mentors, take the opportunity to support and encourage and provide opportunities for emerging scholars and researchers. So I just want to acknowledge those too. So this is just not my work here in this presentation. Relationships matter. So this was something that came out across all of our communities, and that they are the basis with which they form the basis of which communities respond to and adapt to climate change in all of its many facets. Relationships underpin everything that occurs within communities, and they experience this strong sense of togetherness and these embedded practices of collaboration that foster their climate resilience as communities. So we take this strong, what emerged then is this strong Pacific relationality aspect that underpins the way that communities work and its importance. Those relationships are multiple and they exist between different social groupings, and it includes social relationships differentiated by gender, as men, women, as non-binary, and generations as elders, adults, young people, children, and those living with challenges, whether it be disabilities. And they also exist across time and space. These relationships exist across borders. And so while we make these definitions and these distinctions around mobility types based on a single kind of location place, these relationships transcend all of those. And so you will see this when we just explain some of these. We talk about translocal, transnational, trans-indigenous experiences that, in spite of all the challenges, these relationships are a key strength in how they adapt and respond. So as a local example, so these are ones that are located in their villages, they may move within their kind of territorial lands. And we see that they're guided by traditional practices, and in Guadalcanal, we see the practice of shupu, which is something that allows them to be able to move, and by negotiating with landowners in different areas, they're able to, through their customary practice, negotiate a place to stay. And whether that can be with an existing relationship or an existing tie, or it may be a new tie that they establish. So that's certainly something that we've seen in the Puka community in the Cook Islands. They were gifted a piece of land following a cyclone back in the 1940s, and from that experience, and so following that experience, the community, the tribe from that area on the main island of Rarotonga gifted them land so that they could have another place to establish themselves outside of their traditional ties to the Aotearoa island in Puka Puka. Transnationally, we see the Tokelau community hosted by the Tokelau community in Wellington and Purirua. There's a large number of Tokelauans in that part of New Zealand, and so they have and so in establishing themselves in the 1960s, and this was part of New Zealand's response to a 1966 cyclone Connie that damaged Tokelau back then. People put in this relocation policy to allow them to settle and settle on lands in Purirua that New Zealand had taken by warrant from tangata whenua. You might see where this is going in the next part of this. And so as a result of that, the Tokelau community settled in Purirua. Over time, they've managed to buy land. They've built a community hall, and it acts as a place of respite for them to be able to bring their people to host, to gather themselves together and maintain their relationships with their people back at home. And so this is all kind of part of those relationships, so that when it comes to thinking about responding to climate change, they have this foundation, this basis on which these relationships exist, to be able to provide the support and the effort to look after their own. And then thinking about this transnational communities that are established outside of their own home islands, the same Tokelau community have developed a relationship with Ngāti Toa, who have mana whenua over the land there in Purirua. And of course, this is a relationship that's underpinned by displacement of a different kind, with the confiscation of their land that was then subsequently used for building these big housing developments to locate not just Tokelau but other Pacific communities. And over time, they've built up this relationship where it's moved from being one where there was conflict to being one where there is now cooperation between them. And so there's opportunities there to be able to develop partnerships at an Indigenous to Indigenous peoples level that can operate outside of state or government policy planning and intervention. So all of these things also then link to addressing and enhancing the health and well-being of communities. All of these kind of relationships, and this kind of leads into the next slide, where we're really talking about not just the physical health, but other ways in which health is impacted by climate change and how communities respond. Sorry, I know that time is going to bring in here in a second. And really, as an example of the health and well-being impacts of climate change and how that affects their ability to be able to stay where they are, I will talk to you about Bedford. Bedford is in the western province of of Solomons. And it's a small island off the mainland that has that we categorised as a staying in place community, but is actually undergoing relocations at the moment, where they are having to, because of the sea level rise and inundation, they are no longer able to maintain crops on their land. So they have had to re-establish their agriculture sites on the mainland. And so that's a short distance they've got to travel between the island and the mainland for their agricultural planting. And so they have this kind of dual setup where they are now not able to grow their crops where they are having to do that offshore on another piece of land that they ask that does belong to them. But it raises all of those kind of issues around security of food, security around water, and access to safe sanitation facilities. There's links around. So by doing this, they're able to maintain their crops, but it comes at a cost, and it comes at puts pressure on them to be able to think about then what's going to happen in the future, because they obviously want to be able to stay there, but more and more they realise that they can't. They're making these moves internally as a community, making these decisions, and without necessarily government intervention. And the other issue that raises for them is the stress and anxiety and the worry for not just the day-to-day, but the future of their children and their grandchildren about where they will be able to establish themselves. And the other one I want to talk to you about was, did I say Bessel or did I say Buddyhill? That was Buddyhill. The other one is Bessel in Kiribati, which is in South Tarawa. This is a community that is made up of people that have relocated as economic migrants from other atolls and islands in Kiribati to the end of Tarawa. The land that they have has been purchased by through traditional means with the landowner. They have settled there. They are they're not able to grow crops because of the coastal erosion. It's affected their pollution has affected their lagoon, so they're not necessarily able to draw on marine resources. And they've also, because of that, they're having to rely on bulk foods, so reliance on buying flour and sugar and 2-minute noodles, because they don't have access to those natural resources, which then of course has the knock-on effect of health issues with malnutrition in kids, stunting in children and high rates of NCDs. And so all of that, you see those impacts, those negative impacts. But what you also see is this strength of that they have amongst themselves to and their resilience to respond. These communities do not see themselves as vulnerable. There may be indicators that there are vulnerabilities, but they themselves do not see themselves in that way. They see themselves as in control, in charge, and totally responsible for their own futures, which makes, when we think about our approaches in responding to communities in this way, it's clear that we need to be thinking about these in much community-centered ways. It's not enough. They need to be front and center of any decision making that occurs when responding to mobility decisions that they're contemplating. Just quickly, these language and cultural transformations. This really relates to something that was common across all of them around loss of language, and that one example is Vaea, which is in Niue. It has a population of people from Nuatao and Tuvalu that through a gentleman's agreement they moved a number of families, voluntarily moved from Tuvalu, from this atoll to Waia. At that time, Waia had less than six community members left in that community, with the majority of them having migrated to New Zealand for work and education. So this was in the this came about in the 1990s. And so this community have had the struggle of trying to build themselves up as one cohesive group, but also to retain not only their Tuvalu language, to support the Niuean language, and as well as deal with the demands of English in their country. And so the same goes for, so the loss of language is something that's not just a climate change feature, it's something that comes with the movement and of people, and the impact of industrialization, of introduction of modern Western ways into these communities. And so what we see happening is that communities are not only having to deal with things around issues of depopulation, of unsustainable economies, of moving from subsistence living to get a job and find other ways to make money. They're also having on top of that to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so this is where we see climate change really exacerbating those underlying existing issues that many communities already face. Just quickly to say that faith and Christianity was a big feature for many of the communities, and that their faith in God was something that enabled them to respond. We see collaborations between the church and community organisations like in Ambu and Malaita, where the church and the community leaders group were able to work together. They were able to build seawalls and reclaim land, and which is all part of supporting their well-being and their ability to remain on their islands. And I think I'm just going to one more. Sorry, Charlotte. Someone had to do it and it was going to be there. So really just thinking, I think it's important when we're in these policy spaces, we really do need to be thinking beyond the individual, that communities should be considered as a unit of analysis and take into account their interconnected agency that they have, that we do need to pay more attention to that relationship that climate change has on all of these already pre-existing pressures and drivers and challenges that communities face, and that community mobility due to climate change, like any of our mobilities, because we do see ourselves as moving people, we have long histories of movement, that it's also cyclic, that we may go away for a 9-month RSE stint, or we might go away for 3 years worth of education, or we might go away for 3 decades to live in another country and return back. I mean, all of these kind of ideas about how and when we move as part of our life cycle needs to be taken into account when we're thinking about policy interventions and activities. That is just about it. I have to say thank you to our people, to the 17 communities that participated in the study, and the 900 odd individuals that shared with us so generously. Me taki mata. Me taki Tina.
And I'm really much our final speaker for this panel session. We've got Chris Richter, who is the Regional Migration, Environment and Climate Change Specialist at the IOM's Regional Office in Bangkok. He was previously a migration officer with IOM's office to the United Nations in New York, and has also worked in a variety of positions within the Australian government, including in AusAid, the Attorney General's Department, and the former Department of Immigration and Citizenship. And Chris is going to present on the regional framework on climate mobility, which was endorsed by Pacific leaders at the 52nd Pacific Islands Forum's leaders meeting in the Cook Islands in November 23.
All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here, having IOM here. Yeah, I spent a bit of time living and working in Canberra and came to many events like this, but over that side of the podium. So it's kind of fun and a little bit surreal to be back here in this different context. Sorry. I was going to walk around, but no. So in the time that I have to speak to you today, as Charlotte mentioned, I will be talking to you about the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, which is really a very exciting and groundbreaking initiative for those who I assume is all of us here who have an interest in migration and climate change issues. And in the responses that governments and other stakeholders are taking to address this sort of issue. So the key points or key messages, I'll just start with that straight away, that I wanted to I was hoping that you would leave this presentation with. First of all, to really have an appreciation of just how significant and important the development of this framework has been, not just for the Pacific, but in a global context as well. And second is to understand and recognize the need to now support implementation of this framework and to provide adequate sort of technical and financial support in order to help governments do that. So implementation is going to be critical, especially in the face of increasingly extreme and challenging climate and environmental impacts. So before we get to that, though, I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back and talk about what the regional framework is and how it came about. Maybe just a show of hands if you have heard of the Pacific Regional Framework. On a few people, quite a few. All right, that's good. Well, as Charlotte mentioned, and as many of you would probably know, the framework was indeed endorsed by the member states of the Pacific Islands Forum at last year's leaders meeting in Cook Islands. And it was really another example of many examples, actually, of the commitments that Pacific governments have made in recent years to highlight the specific challenges of climate and environmental change and how those challenges impact them, and to mobilize action to respond as well. And so the stated objective of the regional framework is really to guide Pacific governments and communities and their partners to ensure rights-based and people-centered movement in the context of climate change, including through a proactive regional approach that reflects Pacific interests in a culturally appropriate manner, which is, of course, quite an important feature of the framework. Now, just as the regional framework is a reflection of the significant commitments and action that Pacific governments have been taking, it's also, I think, reflects an increased global interest in the issues related to human mobility and climate change. So, especially since the early 2000s, more and more attention has been paid to climate mobility in the context of several global frameworks and agreements on a range of different topics. So discussions on climate mobility have been integrated into different work streams under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example, starting with the Canterbury Adaptation Framework, which was back in 2010, I think it was, but also the Paris Agreement itself, one of the related decisions of which established a task force on displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. The Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, meanwhile, included various commitments around addressing the adverse drivers of migration, including climate and environmental factors. And at the same time, the strength of evidence around this topic has also started to grow as well. So if you look at the most recent 6th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that report provides a fairly comprehensive overview of the latest state of knowledge and evidence on that topic, on this topic. And what that report highlights with a high degree of confidence, I should say, that climate hazards associated with both extreme events and climate variability are both direct and indirect drivers of human mobility. So within this increased attention and interest globally at the regional and national levels as well, governments have also started to take action. And this is where Pacific governments have really shown their leadership in endorsing the Pacific Regional Framework, which in many ways is the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Now, if you're a keen observer of multilateral climate mobility frameworks, you might quite correctly point out to me that countries in Africa actually endorse what they call the Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change the year before the PIF leaders did. But why I'm sort of a bit bulky about the Pacific, I guess, is, well, for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, I think this regional declaration is much more detailed and comprehensive than other similar frameworks. It was endorsed, of course, through the formal processes of an intergovernmental body, in this case, the PIF. And because of that, it also has a number of high income countries that are part of it, of course, Australia and New Zealand being PIF members. And so that's sort of a little bit unique as well. At the same time, the Pacific Framework was developed through a several years long process of consultation and engagement with governments, civil society organizations and communities most impacted by climate change. So the process involved bilateral briefings with governments, understanding and awareness raising activities, including regional dialogues and consultations. And it also involved a drafting process that, of course, necessitated different iterations and feedback mechanisms before making its way through the formal processes of the PIF, including at the technical level, the ministerial level, and finally to the PIF leaders. So, I mean, it was very much a member state led process, but one that also engaged different stakeholders across the Pacific. Now, the community consultation process that was part of the preparation for the regional framework identified some quite diverse perspectives on mobility. And so what you'll see on the screen here are some of the comments that were received from communities in Tuvalu. And you'll notice there are some, very strong views about communities, or at least different parts of communities, highlighting their preference to stay in place and to identify adaptation options to help them to do that as long as possible. And these sorts of views are quite common across the region, as you might imagine, given the strong connections that people have with their ancestral lands. But at the same time, there's also a growing recognition that climate hazards are already affecting communities. Communities are already being displaced or have to move. And therefore that this is, there's a need to prepare for that eventuality, to think through how to respond, which is a key part as well of the proactive regional response as outlined in the framework. So the text and structure of the framework has really attempted to integrate and balance these sorts of diverse perspectives and priorities. So you'll see, for example, that its guiding principles include issues around human rights and human security, and protecting culture, cultural heritage and identity, as well as statehood as well. And it also includes a whole part on staying in place, even before it speaks to the different forms of movement that have to be addressed, which again, I think speaks to the overall desire of people to stay in their homes as long as possible. And indeed staying in place is in fact the fundamental priority of Pacific Island countries, with migration being seen as something that should only take place as a matter of choice rather than of necessity. So when it does consider human mobility, it does so from a fairly comprehensive perspective in that it addresses several different forms of human mobility. Everything from planned relocation, regular migration, evacuation, displacement, and it also considers the situation of existing migrants who are overseas and the extent to which those migrants might need to be supported in the event of a disaster or similar event in the host country, for example. So when you're thinking about typologies, maybe that's also something to consider as well. And this is really a terrific approach to take, because I think it does recognize the complexity of the relationship between climate change and human mobility, and points to the fact that it's not just about displacement, even though that's sort of the common issue that people tend to think about first when talking about these sorts of issues. And of course, it's a feature of much of the media reporting as well, as others have alluded to in these discussions about climate refugees and so on. But we know, of course, that there's much more to the issue than that. Okay, so now we have this framework. I guess the obvious question is, what next? So this goes to the point I highlighted at the outset, that implementation and financing are now absolutely critical. So process-wise, the PIF member states are now developing an implementation plan, which will go through a lengthy process similar to that to develop the regional framework itself, including several meetings under the PIF subcommittee on regional security and the forum officials committee. There will also be a regional consultation before that sort of draft implementation plan goes to the PIF leaders for endorsement, hopefully at the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders meeting in 2025. Beyond these formal processes, it's also a critical time for international partners, including civil society organizations and academia, to help mobilize support and technical expertise for implementation as well. Now, up to this point, the development of the regional framework has been supported by an interagency joint program involving IOM, OHCHR, UNESCO, ILO, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the PIF Secretariat as partners. And was funded by the New Zealand government as well as the UN Trust Fund for Human Security. And this has been a really fantastic example of collaboration amongst agencies working together with the Pacific governments towards what is an incredible outcome in terms of the framework itself. And the program, which is called the Pacific Climate Change, Migration and Human Security Program, or PCCMHS, will run until early next year. This timer is very confronting, I have to say. Anyway, so the overall objective of the PCCMHS is to strengthen the resilience and adaptive capacity of Pacific Islanders in the context of climate change and disasters. And it is working towards that through three main outcomes. First, by supporting cooperation amongst governments at the regional and sub-regional level on climate mobility. And this is where the support for the implementation plan and the ongoing discussions around the framework itself will be supported. The second outcome focuses on building the capacity of government counterparts and providing them with the tools and resources needed to develop national level policies and plans to respond to climate impacts. And the third has sort of much the same sort of priorities, but with a focus on supporting civil society actors and communities themselves to engage in and contribute to national level policy development and so on. Now, in the short time I have left, I won't go through these in detail, but just to share some examples of what countries are already doing in implementation of the framework with support from the PCCMH partners. one thing you'll notice is that planned relocation is receiving an increasing amount of interest as a potential tool in this space. But different countries are at different stages, I suppose, in terms of their consideration of the issue. In PNG, for example, we're working with the government to develop a dedicated planned relocation policy, for which we'll also draw upon examples from other countries across the region. Fiji, Solomon Islands, for example, already have planned relocation plans in place. I'm keeping an eye on it, don't I? What was I saying? Fiji, Solomon Islands. Yeah, but in the Marshall Islands, however, the work will focus on developing a white paper on planned relocation. So they're not quite at the same stage. And that's really just an opportunity to have that sort of discussion with communities and to try to integrate their perspectives into the process as well. There's also quite a strong focus on capacity building in several countries. In Fiji, for example, initiatives will be working with communities to better understand the risks of climate change and disasters, how that impacts mobility, and what they might be able to do to respond. In Palau, the government is also looking to integrate human mobility into their national adaptation plan, which is, of course, one of the key documents under the UNFCCC processes that governments have developed. And this is also somewhat of a priority for IOM as well, to work with governments. And we're doing it outside the Pacific, but in other countries in Asia as well, to integrate human mobility into those sorts of plans and frameworks. Then Tonga will be developing a national spatial plan framework, which is really, a tool to help guide their understanding and responses to climate hazards. And in Tuvalu, efforts will focus on developing a framework to support their national climate change policy. And efforts will also undertake capacity building to help their policymakers, their negotiators, to sort of take these sorts of issues to the global level and to help them integrate or draw attention to the particular challenges being faced by the Pacific in some of these global fora, like the COP processes, for example. So this is all very very positive and quite exciting as well, I would say. But as I mentioned, moving forward, implementation will be absolutely critical. And this is an area where partners from across the region, whether we're talking about international organizations, civil society, academia, all of you in this room, basically, would have an important contribution to make, whether it's research and access, or what have you. And events like this, I think, can also help shape those sorts of processes. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion about that. So thank you.
Are there any questions?
Thank you. Maybe a comment and a question, and yeah, thanks for the great presentations. The comment is around the paradox on development, and to Australian colleagues in the room, to what extent they think that might also apply to Australia. If we think about policy coherence and Australia supporting education and healthcare, for example, in the Pacific, where we see classroom sizes doubling as teachers leave, hard to find nurses in many places, and sometimes small communities with 40% of adult men out, and a concern about boys growing up in the absence of role models. So I think it's interesting to think about development and wins, and maybe are there, pragmatic tensions there that I think that could be also for Australia. Is one comment. The other one is perhaps to link two of the presentations with a question around the labour mobility, and what we sometimes see in the Pacific is some challenges around governance of recruitment of those joining the scheme, and not perhaps using that, this came up in the discussion yesterday, as a potential instrument to support communities who have to relocate. So the recruitment sometimes takes a pretty haphazard course. It might be where there's an easiest flight, good access, targeting communities, and sometimes with a heavy impact on those small populated communities I mentioned. rather than maybe thinking about the communities might have to relocate and do need funds for that relocation. So how could we maybe join up rather than seeing that as purely private, a private affair, or just private sector based as an option? Thanks. Sorry, Michael from UNICEF Pacific.
Yeah, no, thank you for those comments. I guess, so my understanding of the question is, yeah, how can we improve our targeting of the most vulnerable in schemes like RSE to support climate mobilities, as opposed to maybe the ways that it's currently happening at the moment. I don't know if I have a comprehensive or deep answer to that one at the moment. I think that my view is definitely somewhat of an outside one, and I think the intricacies of the recruitment stuff, I'm probably not as well across as I could be as someone working in the space. But what I have to say to that is I think that that's definitely a consideration that we would need to look into to increase schemes that are like the RSE responsiveness to climate mobility. So yeah, I'm sorry, it's not very deep or interesting for your question, but yeah, I think it's really important considerations.
Any other comments?
Maybe just to sort of tack onto that a little bit as well. So on the labour migration side of things, for example, you know, certainly from the IOM side, and not just us but others as well, also tend to talk about, you know, labour migration as a positive adaptation strategy to climate change impacts and so on. But there is a but, and often it's that whether or not, or the extent to which that is true, depends on, you know, how that labour migration takes place, what the outcomes are for the origin, but also outcomes for the individual migrant and the destination in terms of, you know, labour standards, exploitation, all of that sort of thing. So when we look at that topic, we have to look at it from a fairly broad perspective. It's not just sort of movement as an adaptation strategy to climate change. It's also about, you know, labour standards. It's also about you know, regular migration pathways and how those are developed and so on. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but just sort of some additional points to think about in that context. And you also asked about the what is your phrase that you use?
Yeah.
Yes, the resilience paradox. I really like that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also something certainly for Australia to consider, how that sort of idea applies to its own activities in the space as well. I mean, the Fallapelli Union with Tuvalu, when it was announced, I mean, the initial reaction was, wow, this is, you know, fantastic. And it's something that is, I guess, unusual for Australia to be engaged with. But of course, it is tied to security commitments and other things like that. So yes, we do have to definitely take those sorts of issues into consideration as well.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. I guess just responding from the Australian government perspective, just I think the point of difference between RSE and the PALM scheme on this is that we have never made a link between climate mobility and the PALM scheme. Climate change mobility is not an objective of the PALM scheme. It's very clearly about labour mobility. I think, you know, my headline message anytime I meet with anyone from the Pacific is that the PALM scheme is a partnership, and it is about, for us, finding the ways that each participating country can take part in the scheme in a manner that best takes advantage of the opportunities that labour mobility presents, but also balances the challenges that we know labour mobility can sometimes present. For us, that's not a set and forget. We don't sort of say, you know, you work it out. Across the region, we're working with pretty much every government in different ways to manage that. So, you know, for example, with Fiji, obviously probably the most mature economy across the region, we've recently had Barney Glover, who some of you might know from his former role working at the University of the South, working in connection with the University of the South Pacific, who is now Australia's Jobs and Skills Commissioner. travel up to Fiji to talk to the government there about how do we build the skills that we need in Fiji to backfill those gaps that are left by departing workers to sort of manage those brain drain issues. You know, we've worked with the government of Tonga on their labour mobility supply strategy. We've had a lot of preliminary conversations with the government of Samoa about how they implement their new policies on labour mobility. And, you know, to answer some of those questions about targeting the most vulnerable, of course, they're in the process of evolving responsibility for selecting workers to communities so that they can take into account all of those things that you've raised. So, you know, for example, in the healthcare sector for Palm, we have this aged care expansion program, which is looking to mobilise more workers into Australia's aged care sector. In each of the countries participating in that scheme, we've put in place a really robust selection process where it's only open to workers who aren't currently working in the healthcare sector, in an effort to try and build that sort of net skills gain for the Pacific, rather than taking very much needed workers from, you know, those industries where they are needed. So I think none of those solutions are perfect. But I think for us, what we're constantly trying to do is strike that balance between the opportunities and challenges. We won't always get it right. And I think one thing that every person in this room needs to acknowledge is it's also difficult on the Pacific side. No government wants to be the government that turned off labour mobility opportunities for their people. So it's challenging for them to deal with as well. So I think really welcome all of the sort of suggestions that as academics you're all bringing forward today, and we put all of them into the mix. We want to hear them. We want to hear about how we can improve the PALM scheme. But just noting that is our objective, to support each country to participate in the scheme on the terms that each judge best meets its needs. Yeah.
Thanks, Carly. It is 11 o'clock, so
I just wanted to respond to Michael as well. I think it was about 2015, I wrote a paper about how to use labour migration to assist in times of natural disasters, because Spain does it with Colombia and they do it very well. And I've sat with DFAT, who are very interested, with the humanitarian team. The problem here is, and I can use Vanuatu as an example with EPI, a lot of the agents actually targeted people to come from, after they've been relocated from EPI Island, to come to the SWP and RSE. However, times of natural disasters, guess where those workers were? They weren't around because they were in RSE and SWP. So yes, we can target people from certain areas, but then you've got that paradox, then they're not there, or when a cyclone comes to do sandbags up there, so you're missing that. So there is that really hard balance to get, and especially when you're talking about operators in Vanuatu, where they've got agents as well. Oh, sorry, Rochelle Bailey, Department of Pacific Affairs. Thank you.
no other questions, we might, I'm sure there'll be people who want to ask questions over the break, but we might have a break for morning tea. Everyone will be looking forward to a cup of coffee. So we'll be back sharp at 11:30.